There was a velvet rope across my driveway, a valet stand where my cattle trough used to be, and on my porch, my damn porch, a woman in red heels was auctioning off my ranch like it was a bottle of wine. She was the HOA president, and she called the cops on me. If I hadn't come home a day early, I might have lost everything my father built. Comment below where you're watching from and tell me, what would you do if you came home and found your land up for sale without your permission? I was only supposed to be gone for 5 days, a quick consulting trip in Colorado. I left Ricky, my ranch hand, in charge, and everything was quiet when I left. Cows fed, fences patched, gates locked. But when I turned off County Road 16 and saw Audis and Teslas lined up like it was a wine tasting, my stomach dropped. I thought maybe someone had gotten lost. Or worse, maybe something had happened to Ricky. But then I saw the signs, Legacy Ranch Redevelopment Preview, presented by Evergreen HOA. And standing at the center of it all, microphone in hand, was Celeste Whitmore. Celeste, queen of the HOA, was wearing her signature blazer and a smile that could cut glass. She saw me pulling in and didn't even blink. Instead, she said, "And next up, Lot 7, featuring original timber beams and scenic pond access. Bidding starts at $600,000. Lot 7 was my backyard. I parked hard, stepped out, and made it 20 feet before a kid in a clip-on tie stepped in my path. "Sorry, sir, this is a private event." I laughed, not because it was funny, because if I didn't, I might throw him into the fountain. "I live here," I said. "You're standing on my land." Before he could respond, Celeste chimed in again, louder this time. "Security, please escort this man off the property. He's not authorized to be here." I froze. "Authorized?" I repeated, turning toward her. "I'm the damn owner, Celeste." She walked toward me, clipboard in hand, as if I were some confused delivery guy. "Clay," she said, fake sweet, "you've been absent for more than 30 days. Per HOA bylaw 642, this property was reclassified as dormant and we're moving forward with redevelopment." I clenched my jaw. "I was gone 5. She raised an eyebrow. "We measure absence by activity, not calendar days." That's when the sirens rolled in. 3 sheriff units pulled up. Celeste pointed theatrically. "That man is disrupting a sanctioned community event and threatening attendees." The deputies stepped out, slow, eyes flicking between me and the makeshift auction tent. One of them, Deputy Rowland, recognized me. "Mr. Randall?" I nodded. "You got papers showing you own this land?" I handed him a laminated copy of the deed I always kept in my glove box. After a pause, he nodded back. "Looks solid." Then he turned to Celeste. "Ma'am, unless you've got documentation that says otherwise, we're going to have to ask you to stand down." The air shifted. Guests started murmuring. Celeste's jaw tensed. "This is a civil matter," she spat. "We'll let the lawyers handle it." She turned her back and walked away, but not before leaning in close and whispering, "This isn't over." I watched her retreat, her high heels stabbing into my lawn like bayonets. The event disbanded in slow motion. Champagne flutes left half full, folding chairs knocked over. Someone even tried to take a brochure with my name on it. I didn't stop them. I was too busy walking to the porch, my porch, and unlocking the front door that hadn't seen another key in over 40 years. Inside, I went straight for the old war chest my father left behind. Beneath the medals and photos was a thick leather folder with the original deed, the full 5-page document, including one crucial clause added in 1982. Owner reserves unilateral veto over all third-party claims to land use in event of contested jurisdiction. I stared at the word, veto. That word was about to become Celeste's nightmare. As I closed the folder, my phone buzzed, a message from Ricky. "Boss, you might want to see what she just sent to the HOA email list. She's calling you a squatter." I stood there, fingers tightening on the folder. So this wasn't just about land anymore. This was war. The next morning, the entire ranch felt tainted. The air was still clean, the sun still golden across the field, but I couldn't unsee the memory of strangers sipping Chardonnay where my cattle used to roam. I walked the fence line with my coffee, boots crunching against gravel, passing a few discarded brochures left behind by yesterday's prospective buyers. One flyer even had a digital rendering of my barn, with the roof replaced by solar panels and labeled as a wellness center. I crumpled it without reading further. Whoever dreamed that up hadn't spent a single minute wrestling a frostbitten calf or burying a rusted tractor axle in the rain. They didn't understand land. But Celeste, she understood loopholes. And that's what made her dangerous. I headed into town. First stop, the county recorder's office. I needed to know exactly what kind of paper trail Celeste had tried to manufacture. The clerk behind the window was a guy named Kent, mid-30s, good head on his shoulders, and someone I'd helped a few years back when his hunting license got messed up in a computer crash. He recognized me immediately. "Clay? What brings you here? You finally ready to sell that back pasture to the solar company?" I smiled. "Not unless they want to buy the HOA with it." "Listen, Kent, I need all recent filings tied to Parcel 48, Section 7, especially anything filed by or related to Evergreen HOA. He raised an eyebrow, tapped at his keyboard, then muttered, "Well, hell." Turns out Celeste had filed a redevelopment claim less than 72 hours after I left for Colorado. She'd bundled my ranch into a larger zoning map update claim. It had fallen under provisional governance expansion thanks to a recent vote passed at an HOA meeting I hadn't been invited to. Worse, she had filed an intent to establish redevelopment rights form, a document that wasn't legally binding in itself but could trigger bureaucratic reviews that freeze a property owner's ability to conduct major repairs or land modifications. I stared at the screen while Kent scrolled. "She filed this without a single signature from you?" he asked. "Not one," I said, "and here's the kicker. I wasn't even gone a full week." Kent leaned in, dropped his voice, and added, "Man, you pissed off the wrong petty dictator." Armed with those records, I drove across town to the office of Henry Tate, my late father's old attorney. Henry was 79 if he was a day, and sharp enough to carve legal arguments into stone with a butter knife. He lived in a white colonial house that doubled as his firm. Just 2 rooms, a ceiling fan older than the moon landing, and enough paper files to wallpaper Texas. When I walked in, he didn't even look up from his yellow legal pad. "You've got trouble, Clay," he said, like he'd been expecting me. "How bad is it?" I asked, taking a seat across from his desk. "Bad enough that if you blink wrong, Celeste might file a zoning claim against your eyelids," he muttered, finally looking at me. "But not irreversible. She's using legal intimidation, bureaucratic mud wrestling. We'll get dirty, but we won't drown." Henry explained the game. HOA laws varied, but in Texas they only had governance over properties that either opted in or fell under post-division expansion. My ranch wasn't part of any subdivision, never had been, but Celeste had cleverly tried to piggyback on a 30-year-old map update that loosely mentioned residential corridors adjacent to County Road 16. The one that curved past my north fence. "They're arguing adjacency equals jurisdiction?" I asked. Henry nodded grimly. "It's flimsy, but enough to stall you, and if you push too hard, they'll start talking about tax reviews, code enforcement visits, and eminent domain whispers. Celeste isn't just playing the long game, she's baiting you into making a mistake." I leaned back, feeling the weight settle in my chest. Part of me wanted to just call in a camera crew, expose the scam, and let the court of public opinion burn her plans to ash. But that would have been too easy and too reactive. I needed leverage, real leverage, something that would make her regret ever stapling my name to one of her glossy brochures. That night, I sat at my father's old desk with a bottle of rye whiskey and a stack of land records. I flipped through survey maps, water rights agreements, grazing permits, anything that might shine a light on a crack in her foundation, and just before midnight, I found it. A topographic map from 1982, signed by a county surveyor. It marked a narrow irrigation canal that cut diagonally through my southern pasture, technically dividing the land into 2 plots, one primary, one auxiliary. That auxiliary plot was small, maybe half an acre, but it had never been formally merged back into the main property, meaning technically it was still classified as undeclared. And undeclared land doesn't fall under residential governance unless specifically petitioned, which Celeste hadn't done. "You missed a corner, Celeste," I muttered aloud. "And corners are where empires collapse." I made copies of everything and tucked them into a folder labeled Playbook. By morning, I'd have a new plan. Before I could leave the study, though, my phone buzzed. A notification. Apparently, HOA members had received a newsletter titled Reclaiming the Future, Evergreen's Bold New Chapter. In it was a blurry photo of my barn, taken during yesterday's auction, and a paragraph claiming the property was in early stage conversion. The text claimed that, while legal formalities remain pending, the community's vision continues moving forward thanks to proactive leadership. I stared at that word, pending. She was walking a legal tightrope and betting I wouldn't be fast or clever enough to knock her off. Fine, let her walk. The next morning, I paid a visit to one of the most overlooked, underappreciated offices in any county, the Agricultural Zoning Board. I asked to review irrigation permits issued between 1975 and 1990. After 3 hours and a lot of coughing from the guy in the records room, I walked out with a sealed file showing that Auxiliary Pastures Canal wasn't just a ditch, it was a registered water conduit with easement rights granted to my grandfather. In other words, that little sliver of land had a personality, legally speaking, and the HOA, they hadn't even noticed it existed. Back at the ranch, I climbed up the old watchtower my dad had built during his doomsday prepper phase and looked out over the fields. I didn't see grass and fences anymore. I saw chess squares. Celeste thought she was playing Monopoly, buying up land and building hotels. But I was playing chess, and I'd just moved a knight into her blind spot. She didn't know it yet, but I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was setting the table for her collapse. 3 days later, I put on the ugliest sports coat I owned, slicked my hair back with a dab of motor oil disguised as pomade, and walked into Celeste's trap like it was my wedding. The event was called Investor Preview and Private Bid Mixer, and it was held in a tent big enough to cover a helicopter. They'd set it up right in my northern pasture. Inside was the kind of crowd that ordered bottled water from France and thought ranch was just a salad dressing. Everyone was sipping wine out of stemware that cost more than my boots. And in the center of it all, standing on a tiny stage under a faux chandelier made of reclaimed barnwood, was Celeste. She wore a cream pantsuit, high heels buried in turf, and a face full of Botox confidence. I adjusted my fake name badge, Mark Walters, Strategic Land Acquisition Consultant, and walked into the lion's den grinning. Mark had a story. He worked with private equity, had a portfolio full of land to luxury conversions. He also, conveniently, had no online footprint because he preferred offline, discreet investments. I spoke just loud enough for her team to overhear. I hear the ranch parcels are nearly ripe for flipping, I said casually to a man in loafers who smelled like imported citrus. It's going to be a shame if we don't move fast before regulatory heads start poking around. The man nodded solemnly, no clue what I was talking about. Celeste saw me before I reached the fruit display. Her eyes narrowed, her mouth twitched, but she didn't blow the whistle. No, she assumed I was just another player, another ego with cash and a crooked moral compass. That was her first mistake. The auction itself was a soft one, no formal gavels, just silent interest cards, for folks to fill out with their preferred bid ranges. One of the younger agents handed me a laminated packet outlining various lots. Lot 7 was my chicken coop. Lot 9 was my fishing pond. Lot 3, they claimed, was a scenic overlook with development potential. It was a limestone ridge with 3 rattlesnake dens and a view of nothing. And still, I watched someone write down a bid for over $600,000. That's when I knew. This wasn't just ambition, this was delusion with capital backing it. I waited until Lot 5 came up. That was the acre behind my house with the original smokehouse and an old oak tree where my father buried his dog. It had heritage appeal, apparently. Bidding interest came from 3 parties, one of whom looked like he sold crypto pyramids at country clubs. I raised my hand and said, $1.2 million, cash. The room hushed. Even Celeste blinked. Someone gasped. I leaned forward and added, contingent on immediate possession and HOA override authority. It was a bluff, a big one, but Celeste couldn't afford to call it, not in front of investors. She beamed at me like I'd just proposed marriage. Ladies and gentlemen, she said, holding her microphone with one manicured claw, we are honored to welcome Mr. Walters to our investment family. His commitment is a testament to Evergreen's future. Cameras flashed. I smiled. My molars ached from clenching. As soon as the applause died down, I walked up to the booth marked Investor Services and handed them my bid card with a big, phony signature. I'll need to inspect the property deed personally, I said. Wouldn't want any legal surprises. The woman nodded, gave me a folder with glossy brochures, and whispered, Miss Whitmore will meet you shortly. And she did. 5 minutes later, behind the tent, with her arms crossed and her mouth curled into a snarl that would melt plastic. You're insane, she hissed, and very, very stupid. I let the accent slip just slightly. Funny, that's what people always say before they lose. She leaned in. You don't have the money, you're bluffing, and when this collapses I will sue you for fraud so hard your cattle will need lawyers. I smiled and held up a small voice recorder. Say that again, would you? She went silent, then smirked. You think you're clever, Clay, but you're not the only one with recordings. Just remember, this land sits in a gray zone. If I file the right noise complaint, your entire ranch could be declared hostile for livestock. And don't forget the fire safety board. One matchstick and your barn becomes evidence. She turned and walked away, heels stabbing divots into the ground like punctuation marks. I watched her go, heart pounding, not from fear, but from adrenaline. She had just tipped her hand. She was afraid. And that meant it was time to show my ace. That night, I uploaded the voice recording and sent it straight to Henry. She's threatening sabotage, I told him. Implied arson, zoning harassment, and legal retaliation. He whistled on the other end of the line. She's getting sloppy, he said. Good, keep her talking. Meanwhile, I'll draft a cease and desist with attached audio evidence. Let's make her squirm. But Celeste wasn't done. The next morning, I found a notice taped to my fence. Pending investigation. Potential land misrepresentation. The HOA logo was in bold, and underneath it, a threat. All transactions involving Parcel 48 are temporarily suspended pending administrative review. That's when I realized what she'd done. My fake bid had triggered a legal freeze. She'd used my bluff against me. By appearing to sell the land, she'd justified halting all development, including my own. I paced the porch like a caged dog, reading the notice over and over. It was clever, insidious, a technical checkmate if I didn't move fast. Then I remembered something. Lot 5. The one I bought. According to her own brochure, the buyer had the right to request a site inspection, escorted by HOA compliance officials. That was my in, not as the landowner, but as the fake buyer. I could walk into my own ranch under HOA supervision, poke around, and dig up the weak spots in her plan. Hell, I could even plant a few. The next afternoon, I scheduled my inspection. Celeste didn't show. She sent her assistant, a nervous guy named Nolan who looked like he cried at Pixar movies. He followed me around like a duckling while I assessed the condition of the smokehouse, took photos of the soil, and asked leading questions about drainage and zoning permits. Nolan admitted, very casually, that most of the new map hasn't been reviewed by the county yet. I almost kissed the poor idiot. I ended the inspection at the southern boundary, right where that auxiliary strip of land sat, unnoticed and quietly defiant. I took a photo of the old irrigation channel, then another, then looked back at Nolan and asked, "Tell me, does the HOA plan on including this plot in their filings?" He blinked. Plot? That's not on the development sheet. I smiled. No, that's funny, because it has a registered water easement, which means it predates Evergreen's jurisdiction entirely. I let that hang in the air. Nolan turned a shade paler. By the time I walked back to my porch, the wheels were already turning. I'd baited the hook. Celeste thought she'd turned my play against me, but she hadn't noticed that I'd marked the board. The game wasn't over. It hadn't even started. The day after the inspection, Henry and I sat side by side at his creaky old desk with papers spread out like a war map. He wore his usual suspenders, glasses halfway down his nose, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug that said, "World's Oldest Paralegal." I laid out the photos I'd taken, especially the one with the irrigation channel and the faded metal stake that marked the southern property line. "This here," I said, tapping it with the back of a pencil, "is our missile silo." Henry smirked. "That auxiliary parcel is unlisted, unclaimed, and unzoned. Technically, the HOA doesn't know it exists. You know what that makes it?" I raised an eyebrow. "A legal landmine," he nodded. "And if we time it right, it'll blow their whole case to hell." The plan was simple. We'd draft a demand letter citing the irrigation easement and the land's undeclared status. Then file a preemptive motion with the zoning board requesting official reclassification. That motion, once submitted, would trigger a public hearing, which meant documents, testimonies, county review, and worst of all for Celeste, delays. Developers' HOA boards hate the public spotlight. But to pull it off, we needed one thing, a copy of the original HOA charter and amendment schedule. And that document locked in Celeste's office. So I did what any reasonable man would do. I called Ricky. Ricky had been laying low since the first confrontation. Not because he was afraid. No, Ricky didn't fear much outside of women and gluten, but because Celeste goons had threatened to report him for unauthorized machinery use if he didn't step off the ranch. When I found him at his cousin's trailer park fixing a busted ATV, he greeted me with a smirk and a half-empty DR Pepper. "I figured you'd show up eventually," he said. "Woman's got the whole HOA acting like it's the mafia." I filled him in on the situation and asked for one small favor: attend the next HOA board meeting under the pretense of applying for seasonal groundskeeping. Ricky scratched his beard. "You want me to infiltrate a bunch of wine moms?" I nodded. "But like, legally?" He took a long sip, wiped his mouth, and grinned. Well, hell, Clay, why didn't you say so sooner? I'll even wear a tie. Meanwhile, I called Nolan, the assistant from the site inspection. I invited him for coffee at the diner and played dumb, acting like I was still an eager investor. I told him I was concerned about potential zoning conflicts and asked if there were any more maps, amendments, or permits I should look over. Nolan, nervous and eager to impress, spilled faster than a knocked-over pitcher. Actually, he said, Ms. Whitmore updated the charter last year, but we haven't filed the changes with the county yet. She said something about waiting for approval by practice, not policy. My ears perked up. Practice? He nodded. You know, like de facto control or whatever. It's kind of her phrase. I smiled, mentally filing away the words. De facto control. That wasn't governance. That was squatting with a newsletter. 2 days later, Ricky showed up at my porch with a grin and a USB stick. Got it off Nolan's laptop, he said proudly. The kid left it open while I was moving potted plants. You won't believe the crap Celeste's been cooking. The files were gold, meeting minutes filled with off-the-record boats, financial statements hinting at personal expenditures billed as consulting, and even a draft email to a developer labeled, "Once the old guy folds, we pounce." Henry read them with quiet satisfaction, then set the folder down and said, "Time to strike." We sent the documents to the county clerk with an official request for audit. Simultaneously, Henry filed the land classification petition, attaching photos, maps, and sworn statements from my father's old surveyor. By Friday, Celeste received a summons to appear before the county zoning board, and that, apparently, scared her enough to fight back in full. That weekend, I woke up to find my front gate padlocked from the outside with a county notice stapled to it. Environmental hazard assessment pending. Do not enter. There were no hazards. There wasn't even trash, just an anonymous complaint, filed with a photo of a potentially leaking fuel drum. That drum? An empty rain barrel from 1973. Celeste had pulled strings. Not legal ones, bureaucratic ones. She was trying to choke me with paperwork, and I'll admit, part of me cracked. I kicked that gate open with a crowbar and stormed up to the ridge to clear my head. I stood there, looking out over the fields where I'd played as a boy, worked as a teen, rebuilt as a man. I felt like she'd taken something invisible but sacred, the piece of ownership, and that's when it happened. The sound of snapping branches. I turned to find 2 HOA inspectors wandering near the canal, clipboard in hand. "You're trespassing," I said. They looked startled. One raised a badge like it meant anything. "We're performing a perimeter compliance review," he said. "Under what authority?" I asked. He hesitated. "Executive committee." I stepped forward. "This is undeclared land outside HOA boundaries." His mouth opened, closed. Then I added, "And you just admitted on camera to unlawful entry." I held up my phone. It wasn't recording, but they didn't know that. They left in a hurry. That night, Henry called with an update. "She hired Brad Colton," he said. I sat up. Brad was a legend. An HOA fixer, smooth as silk and fond of backroom settlements that left people legally broke and emotionally bankrupt. "We need to move now," Henry continued, "before this goes to a judge who plays tennis with her cousin." So I made a new plan, one that used her own ego against her. I emailed Celeste personally, told her I was prepared to settle if she offered me full HOA immunity for the ranch and dropped all claims. I made it sound like I was scared, like I'd fold, like I was desperate. Within an hour, she replied with a draft agreement, a long, smug, bloated contract that crucially attached a revised HOA zoning map with her own initials on it. That map showed my ranch, in full, as governed. But it also included the auxiliary parcel, incorrectly labeled as part of the primary tract. That was her fatal error. She had documented a lie, signed it, and tried to use it as leverage. I printed 3 copies, highlighted the false merge, and added them to my evidence folder. Because when you play dirty, the paper trail always bleeds first. And Celeste, she just handed me the knife. It started with a dead calf. Not exactly the plot twist you'd expect, but out here, death is either natural or deliberate, and I had a gut feeling this wasn't natural. The morning after we sent the revised HOA map to the zoning board, I found one of my heifers limp near the creek, her front leg caught in barbed wire that hadn't been there the day before. The cut was too clean, the wire too fresh, and the way it was placed, it wasn't an accident, it was a message. I didn't have proof. Not yet, but my instincts hadn't failed me in combat zones or courtroom showdowns, and I wasn't about to start second-guessing them now. That was just the beginning. Over the next 48 hours, my ranch turned into a playground for silent harassment. My mailbox was ripped off its post. My internet went down. The well pump tripped 3 times in one day, even though the electrician had just serviced it last month. At first, I thought it was just bad luck stacked on bad timing. But when I saw 2 HOA volunteers, those same 2 clipboard-toting guys from before, lurking near the pasture gate at sunset, I knew. This was Celeste's pushback. She couldn't beat me in court yet, so she was trying to wear me down, to grind me into compliance. And I'll be honest with you, for a moment, it was working. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't work. Every noise outside sent me to the window with my flashlight and sidearm. I started locking the barn, then double-locking it. Ricky brought over his old shepherd dog, Hank, just in case. Hank didn't bark much, but when he did, it meant someone was near. The third night, I heard him growl. I didn't see anything when I stepped out with my shotgun, just tire marks near the western fence and the faint smell of diesel, but that was enough. I called the sheriff the next morning. He came out, took a look, and said the same thing they always say. Without direct footage or a license plate, there's not much we can do. So I did what a man does when he has no one to lean on. I broke down. Quietly. Alone. It was around 2 a.m. I sat in the same chair where my father used to do his nightly readings and stared at the wood stove until the glow faded into ash. I was tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of constantly watching my back on my own land. Tired of thinking 5 steps ahead just to survive the week. I poured 2 fingers of rye, but I didn't drink. I just held the glass and whispered to no one, "Am I losing?" That night, I found my father's notebook. Not the legal stuff, just his personal journal, tucked between 2 old tax books. It was filled with uneven scrawl, taped photos and little clippings of news articles about soil health, crop rotation, and HOA lawsuits from as far back as the 1980s. One line was underlined in red, so hard the pen had almost torn the page. They only win if you give up your peace before they take your land. I don't know why that hit me like it did. Maybe because it was true. Maybe because I knew damn well Celeste didn't care about property. She wanted obedience. The next morning, I decided I wasn't going to play defense anymore. I pulled out every document I had, every file Ricky had snagged, every statement Nolan had let slip, and I built a case, not just legal, but personal. I wasn't going to fight her through protocol anymore. I was going to expose her for what she was. But before I could submit the whole thing to the county, my email got flooded. Nearly 24 messages, newsletters, anonymous tips, and most jarringly, a mass forward of a local news blog claiming I was under investigation for fraudulent claims and land misuse. There were photos, too, blurry, old, some from when I did security work overseas, others from a veterans rally that had been miscaptioned to imply political extremism. Celeste had gone nuclear, and she wasn't doing it through the HOA anymore. She was pulling in outsiders, PR firms, bloggers for hire, maybe even private investigators. My reputation wasn't just under fire, it was being remodeled into something crooked, and worst of all, people started believing it. The barista at the diner didn't smile when I came in. The feed store clerk was out of stock for an order I'd placed a week prior. Even Ricky said someone had asked him if I was prepping for war out on the ranch. That cut deep, because it meant the war had reached past me, into my town, into people I trusted. Henry told me to hold. Let it peak, he said. Let her overextend, then we slap her with everything. But I wasn't built for waiting. I needed to move. That night, I sat at my desk and crafted a letter. Not to the zoning board, not to the HOA, but to every single resident of Evergreen. A real letter, printed, folded, and hand-delivered one by one to every mailbox I could reach before sunrise. It was simple, 1 page. I told them the truth. About Celeste, about the lies, about the silent war happening on their borders. I didn't ask for support, I asked for eyes. Watch her, I wrote. See what she does when she thinks no one is looking. By noon, the fire started spreading. People talked. Nolan quit, straight up packed a box, left his keys on Celeste's desk, and drove off. Ricky said he heard 3 board members arguing outside a Panera Bread about damage control. Even the sheriff called to say he'd received an unusual volume of calls, asking why the HOA had unfiled zoning maps in circulation. Celeste tried to respond with another PR blast, but it was too late. The community didn't believe her anymore. They weren't on my side yet, but they were off hers. And that's all I needed. Then came the kicker. A certified envelope delivered by courier, Inside, a cease and desist order from Brad Colton himself, demanding I refrain from public commentary that could negatively impact Evergreen's economic outlook. I laughed so hard I choked on my coffee. Brad had one rule: when he starts sending paperwork, it means he's bleeding somewhere you can't see. I handed the envelope to Hank the dog. He used it as a chew toy. Then I called Henry. "It's time," I said. "Let's make it official." We filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office, attaching evidence of land misrepresentation, coordinated harassment, and unlicensed zoning maneuvers. And at the end of it, Henry added one more thing: a request for an emergency injunction against Evergreen HOA. Signed, stamped, submitted. Celeste had thrown everything she had at me, and for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid, because I knew something she didn't. She was about to see what happens when the land fights back. The public hearing was held on a Thursday morning in a county building that smelled like old coffee and fluorescent lighting, the kind of place where bureaucrats spend more time fighting their inboxes than making real decisions. I wore my cleanest jeans and the jacket my father used to wear on Sundays, the one with the frayed elbows and the scent of cedar still clinging to the lining. Henry stood beside me, briefcase in one hand, 3 highlighters in the other. "No theatrics," he muttered under his breath, "just facts." I nodded, though I had a feeling this day was going to end with more than just paperwork. Celeste arrived 20 minutes late. She waltzed in like the queen of a HOA-themed soap opera, flanked by Brad Colton and 2 of her board members, Donna Ridgway and Marcus Price, both of whom had faces like dried fruit and ethics to match. Celeste wore navy blue and carried a binder so thick I thought she was preparing for trial, not a zoning board meeting. She barely glanced at me as she passed, but her lips twitched just enough to register contempt. I smiled at her. Big, slow, and full of pity. The chairman of the zoning board, a man named Glenn Holloway, opened the session with the usual monotone droning about agenda items and public record. Then came our case, item 7A. Review of development claims and jurisdictional boundaries pertaining to Parcel 48 and Subparcel 48B, with consideration of HOA governance legitimacy. Glenn read it like he was announcing the winner of a very boring raffle. Then he looked up and said, "We'll begin with the property owner." That was my cue. I walked to the podium, opened the folder in front of me, and began. No theatrics, just facts. I started with the original deed, my grandfather's signature, the county seal from 1937, and the handwritten note about property boundaries, including the southern parcel. Then I moved to the auxiliary land and the irrigation easement from 1982. I pointed out that it had never been merged or redrawn and thus was not subject to any post-division HOA claim. Then I passed around photos, maps, and the letter Celeste had signed labeling the entire tract as governed, despite knowing it wasn't. The board flipped through each page. Slowly. Some scribbled notes, others stared at Celeste like they were just now realizing what kind of fire they were sitting near. Then Henry took over. His voice was slow and dry, but lethal. He detailed the timeline of Celeste's filings, the missing county registrations, the private investor previews, and the false statements made to residents and developers. He introduced the audio recording. Celeste implying arson, legal manipulation, and enforcement threats. The clerk played it aloud, and I watched the room change. You could hear her voice, clear, smug, and dangerously careless. "Just stall him with paperwork. If we hold long enough, he'll break. They always do." Someone in the back audibly gasped. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The damage was done. Then it was Celeste's turn. Brad stepped up like he was auditioning for a courtroom drama. He called our filings outdated, our evidence taken out of context, and the auxiliary parcel irrelevant due to administrative oversight. He cited obscure clauses from bylaws passed at HOA meetings that, conveniently, had never been formally filed. He talked fast, slick, too slick, and when Glenn asked for official documents verifying Evergreen zoning claims, Brad smiled and said, "Unfortunately, we're still compiling that packet. That was his mistake." Henry stood back up and asked, politely, "May I present Exhibit H?" It was the packet, the one Ricky had copied from Nolan's laptop. It showed unvoted amendments, mismatched lot numbers, and even a spreadsheet labeled Projected Gains Post-Ranch Acquisition. The board stared in silence. Glenn finally cleared his throat and said, "This document references financial benefit in anticipation of a deed transfer that, by all evidence, had not occurred. That's deeply concerning." Celeste broke first. She stood up, palms flat on the table, and snapped, "This is a smear campaign. He's manipulating history, dragging this town through the mud for his own pride." Her voice cracked at the end, which made the silence that followed even louder. Glenn leaned forward. "Were you aware that Parcel 48B was legally exempt from Evergreen's jurisdiction?" Celeste hesitated, just a blink. "Just long enough. I interpreted the boundaries as inclusive," she said carefully. Glenn nodded. "And did you file the zoning update with the county?" Brad interjected. "We intended to, but due to clerical—" "That's a no," Glenn said, firmly. Then he looked to the board. "We'll take a 5-minute recess, then we vote." Celeste didn't look at me. She sat rigid, staring at the floor like it had betrayed her. Brad whispered something into her ear, but she didn't respond. Donna and Marcus leaned away from her, visibly nervous. I stood near the back wall and watched the door, waiting for her to bolt. But she didn't. Maybe she still thought she could win. Or maybe she knew she'd already lost and just didn't want to give me the satisfaction. 5 minutes later, the board returned. Glenn cleared his throat again, then said, "Based on the evidence presented, the board unanimously rules in favor of the property owner. All development claims made by Evergreen HOA are hereby rescinded. Further, a recommendation will be submitted for legal investigation into misrepresentation and abuse of zoning authority." That was it. No applause, no celebration, just the cold, satisfying snap of justice sliding into place. As I packed up my documents, Glenn approached and extended his hand. "You fought hard, Mr. Randall. Not many do." I shook his hand. "I wasn't fighting just for me," I said. "I was fighting for everyone who can't afford to fight people like her." Behind me, Celeste stood frozen. A reporter had shown up, someone from a local paper. They started snapping photos. She shielded her face and hissed something to Brad before storming out of the room, and just like that, her empire began to crumble. By sunset, news had spread. Someone posted about it on a neighborhood bulletin board. Ricky told me that 3 other homeowners who had been quietly bullied by the HOA had already filed inquiries into their own property statuses. The sheriff dropped by just before dark, not on business, just to tip his hat and say, "He heard you held your own." He didn't stay long, but before he left, he said, "Word is, she's being called in for an ethics review by the state board." I didn't say anything. I just nodded and walked back toward the barn. I leaned against the fence, staring at the land. My land. The breeze moved through the grass like nothing had ever happened, like it had been waiting for me to come back the whole time. And in that moment, I wasn't angry, I wasn't proud, I wasn't even relieved. I was just still. For the first time in weeks. Celeste tried to bury me in noise, but she forgot something important. Silence can be a weapon too. A week passed, and the ranch finally felt like it belonged to me again. Not just on paper, but in spirit. The birds returned to the eaves, the barn cats started showing up for scraps again, and even Hank the dog seemed less on edge, dozing off under the oak tree like nothing had happened. Ricky came back full-time, and we spent 2 straight days fixing the gate. Celeste's had busted, repainting the sign I'd put up years ago, "Randall Ranch, family owned since 1937. I considered adding a line underneath, "No HOA trespassing." Might even thrown in a skull and crossbones for flair. Celeste, on the other hand, vanished. Not literally, though I wouldn't have been surprised if she'd chartered a one-way jet to Scottsdale. She resigned from the Evergreen HOA due to personal reasons 2 days after the hearing. The statement was posted without ceremony. No photo, no thank you message, just a 1-paragraph shrug of defeat. Her inner circle disbanded like frightened rodents. Donna Ridgway was seen at the community pool trying to talk her way into a water aerobics class she once tried to ban. Marcus Price started delivering Amazon packages part-time. An honest gig, at least. Brad Colton? Rumor had it he pulled out of 3 other ongoing HOA lawsuits once word got around that the state attorney general's office had started requesting his firm's billing records. I didn't throw a party, didn't pop champagne or ride through town like Caesar. Instead, I went to the feed store and bought a flat of sunflower seeds, then drove out to the southern edge of the property, the auxiliary parcel, the one that saved everything. I planted the seeds along the canal, one by one. Not for show, not even for harvest, just as a reminder that something good could grow out of a borderline war. As I stood up and wiped the dirt from my hands, I felt the breeze pick up. It carried that scent of summer coming early. Sun-warmed wood, fresh hay, and the faint trace of whatever dignity Celeste had left blowing away across county lines. But the story wasn't done. 3 weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, just a wax seal that looked like someone had watched too many courtroom dramas. Inside was a formal invitation to appear at a regional HOA accountability symposium. Apparently, my precedent-setting case had been selected for review by a task force looking to reform zoning enforcement standards. At the bottom of the page, in elegant font, it read, "Mr. Randall, we believe your experience could help ensure this never happens again." I snorted. I wasn't looking to become the poster boy for HOA resistance. But part of me knew this wasn't just about me anymore. Henry agreed. "You've done something rare," he said, sipping bourbon on my porch later that night. "You didn't just win, you made her lose, in full view of everyone." He stared off across the pasture. "That's a different kind of justice, the kind people remember." I didn't respond at first, just watched the sun sink behind the hills. Then I said, "She'll come back, you know. Not her exactly, but someone like her. New name, new plan, same poison." Henry nodded. "Then you'll be ready. Or someone else will, because they heard your story." The next morning, Ricky handed me a newspaper. Front page, a blurry photo of Celeste, dressed in beige, sitting in a conference hall with a placard in front of her that read, "Real Estate Consultant." Below the photo, the headline, "HOA President turned Advisor on Community Efficiency Initiative." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. There she was, reborn, repackaged, trying to reinvent herself as a community expert. But this time, I wasn't angry. In fact, I almost admired the gall. Almost. Later that week, I got a knock on the door. It wasn't a neighbor or the mailman. It was a young woman in her 20s, clipboard in hand, car parked just down the drive. "Mr. Randall?" she asked, a little nervous. "I'm with County Planning. We're doing a survey of independent landowners who recently resisted HOA expansion. Would you be willing to answer a few questions?" I raised an eyebrow. "Is this part of some program?" She smiled. "Actually, it's connected to a new county ordinance named after your case. The Randall Clause." I blinked. "You're kidding." She shook her head. "Nope. The clause requires all zoning changes within a half-mile of legacy rural properties to be reviewed in person by a certified county official. No more invisible maps. No more provisional absorption." I couldn't help but grin. "Well," I said, "that's poetic." But the final twist came when I least expected it. One afternoon, I found a drone hovering above my pasture. Not high, low enough that it was clearly being piloted by someone nearby. I tracked it with my eyes, waited for it to dip behind the silo, then drove my ATV to the far ridge. There, hidden behind a stand of cottonwoods, was a rental SUV, license plate from Arizona. I parked 20 feet away, approached slowly, and tapped the driver's side window. The man inside jumped. He wore sunglasses, cargo pants, and the panicked expression of a guy who just realized he's been made. "You lost?" I asked. He didn't answer, just started the engine. Before he could reverse, I snapped a photo of his plate. He peeled off in a hurry, dust cloud trailing behind him like a busted scheme. I sent the photo to Henry, who made a few calls. An hour later, he called me back. "Guess who hired that car?" he said. "Brad Colton. His firm's trying to build a reputation rehabilitation portfolio. They've been documenting people they lost to spin a comeback story." I laughed. "He thinks he's writing a redemption arc?" Henry chuckled. "More like ghostwriting one. But you're part of it, whether you like it or not." I hung up, looked out at the land, and said aloud, "If they want a story, I'll give them one, just not the ending they're expecting." I still get letters sometimes, from folks across the country, people who stood up to bullies in cul-de-sacs and gated communities, people who planted their boots and said, "Not today." Most of them aren't looking for advice. They're looking for confirmation that they're not crazy for wanting peace, for defending something they built. I tell them the same thing every time. The law won't always protect you. But truth? Truth has a way of surviving long enough to matter. And as long as I've got dirt beneath my boots and ink on a deed, no board, no binder, no bleach blonde tyrant in heels is going to take what's mine. Not now, not ever.